Welcome to another episode of Inside R&E, Rosenberg and Estes' podcast. My name is Zachary Rothken. I'm a partner at Rosenberg and Estes, and I head the firm's administrative law department. My practice focuses on complex rent regulatory matters and everything having to do with rent stabilization, regulatory issues, and housing legislation. I'm very excited with this episode. Joining me on this episode is Ann Korchak. Ann is the president of the Small Property Owners of New York, otherwise known as SPONY. Founded in 1984, SPONY is a nonprofit volunteer organization of small housing providers. Many of its members are multi-generational, family-owned businesses with owners' families living alongside tenants in their properties. For nearly 40 years, SPONY has worked and advocated for sound, sustainable, and equitable housing policies. Through advocacy, education, and organizing, SPONY helps owners maintain quality housing in New York's challenging business environment. As president of SPONY, Ann speaks to lawmakers, the media, and anyone who will listen, like me, about the challenges small housing providers face operating their small businesses in New York City and across New York State. Ann, welcome to the Inside R&E podcast.
Thank you so much, Zach. I really appreciate the opportunity to, speak to you and all your listeners about small property owners in New York.
Okay, and we're glad to have you, Ann. So let's get started. Ann, tell us a little bit about your background. What was your career path to becoming the president of SPONY?
Well, for the past 20 years, I've been helping run two small family properties that my husband's family owns. His immigrant grandparents, achieved the American dream, worked hard, purchased a 10-unit building on the Upper West Side in the 1940s, and then about 20 years later, purchased a second building on the same block. So, it's truly a family, multi-generational business, just like you spoke of, a typical SPONY member. So I had, earlier in my career, I did have a real estate background. I spent some time working for the Woolworth Corporation in retail leasing. After that, I worked for a large engineering firm, Parsons Brinckerhoff, in their corporate real estate group. Then I spent a number of years home full-time raising my children, and then began, helping my mother-in-law with the properties. So I jokingly say I married into this mess. But, I was a member of RSA. I mean, the family has been a member of RSA for decades, probably since RSA was founded. So I was, somebody that did attend those meetings monthly. And then during COVID, I connected with SPONY because they were looking for, small property owners to start speaking with lawmakers. And I wound up on one Zoom call and then another, and the next thing you know, I was on the board, and now I'm board president.
You never know. You get married, you never know what it'll lead to.
Right.
So, tell us a little bit about SPONY. I guess my first question is, what is considered a small property?
I would say that we really tend to talk more about the structure of the business as opposed to a unit count. I mean, we have members that maybe just have a two-family home, somebody like the Korchaks who have two 10-unit buildings. So it's really tends to be, people that are very involved in the management of their properties, as opposed to just being an investment vehicle. We are oftentimes multi-generational, right? So, my husband grew up in the building, for a part of his life, moved to the Bronx, now my mother-in-law has grandchildren that live in the building. So, there's that kind of family connection to the property. Your neighbors, who are also the tenants. So rather than a number, we, like to look at it like that. But I would say the bulk of our owners are small building owners or small, 1 to 4 family properties.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you're saying, because usually the narrative that's driven in the media and in a lot of the advocacy from the current political landscape now is that the multi-generational families really are just with tenants, right? My family's been living in this rent-stabilized apartment succession, which is a problem we could discuss another time.
Right.
But we've been in this building for years. My grandmother lived in this building, but they often paint the owners as, like you said, just investment-driven. Corporate machines, but certainly not the case. There are many, many owners who have these family businesses and often live in these buildings themselves, just like all your members of SPONY right there. And it's important that they have a voice as well, because policy can't just be driven by a false narrative.
Right. We have tenants in our building that knew, my children's great grandfather. They never knew him, right? But there are tenants that live there, that were signed their
Wow.
first lease, with Michael Stagen, who's, long deceased, and his great grandchildren now live in the building. And
Wow. And what would you say some of the main challenges property owners face in New York, and how does SPONY support them in navigating these issues and challenges?
well, I would say that our biggest challenges, are, coming from Albany and out of City Hall, legislation and regulation that just make it incredibly difficult for a small operator to kind of navigate the complexities of, some of this legislation or regulations. Most recently in New York City, it's, the announcement of new scaffolding laws, right? Very heavy fines for scaffolding that stays up, beyond maybe it was a 90-day period, I think is what I read. We had scaffolding up several years ago for 10 months, a 16-week project dragged out to 10 months, all completely beyond my control. So,
Right.
Something like that, and the heavy fines that the mayor is proposing, could bury a small property owner. So, the lead regulations, they're constantly, changing, moving the goalpost, right? For years, many good operators, took the steps to remediate lead in their apartments to the testing level that was appropriate or mandated at the time. And now the number has been reduced, and you're kind of having to do that same work over again. So, that's difficult. Legislation coming out of Albany, obviously Good Cause Eviction has been on the advocates' radar for many years. So that's, a worry for us. More recently, at the end of the session, those two Regina bills, I know I've seen your firm write about it extensively. And again, I mean, we're talking about setting up a circumstance where a family like mine, right now we're on the third generation or fourth generation. People have moved, paperwork, maybe we don't have every single invoice, every single piece of paper that one might need to prove a claim, because we're assumed to be guilty of something, the way that bill has been written. Like, they're assuming that there was fraud involved. And,
Correct.
Navigating that will be near impossible for someone like the Korchak family, because the expense and finding, somebody to help us navigate that at a price we could afford would be really difficult.
Yeah, and it's very troublesome because the existing regulations are enough to crush small property owners, but they just seem to be getting worse and worse and worse. I know that SPONY is very involved with addressing a lot of this legislation and problematic proposed legislation. What has SPONY done specifically to address hot topic issues like good cause eviction, rent stabilization, overregulation, and what they call the housing crisis?
Right. We've spent a lot of time the last 3 years meeting with lawmakers, either face to face or via Zoom, and their staff, to let them hear directly from a property owner, what these proposed bills would mean to the operating of our properties and our small businesses. I think that number, when I last looked, was probably close to 300. So we've met with varying degrees of, openness to listen to us. But I would say I'm always surprised at the willingness, of offices to take calls and to listen to us. Like I said, I mean, sometimes they're not always open to what we're saying, but the willingness to take those appointments, is kind of helps us go on, because at some point, that our message is being heard. So we take that, very seriously. We take any opportunity, like the one you've offered me here today, to speak, on this podcast, the media. And there's a little bit of fatigue too. I mean, sometimes it's hard to sit down and speak to somebody who in the end you think that the piece, is not very balanced, but we have to take every opportunity to make sure that our voice is part of the discussion. That's what we try to do. So.
Yeah, I mean, something like good cause eviction, it'll certainly affect, no question about it, large property owners, but small property owners, if something like good cause eviction, does get passed and enacted, I mean, that's spelling some really bad news, potentially.
Right. Yeah, I agree. We're like the canary in the coal mine, right? I mean, it's bad for all owners. We'll feel the impact first and most severely.
Right. On the topic of good cause eviction, just a few months ago, it was reported in some of the media that left-leaning tenant advocates, probably avowed socialists who simply don't believe in the concept of property rights, they wrote a letter to Governor Hochul, and in that letter, they claimed to have collected signatures of, I believe, over 100 landlords, they claimed,
Right.
in support of good cause eviction. And when I first saw this, I said, come on, this is too impossible to even joke about, right? Let alone for them to say this in writing with a straight face to the governor of New York State, right? Right away, you were very vocal in your skepticism of that so-called landlord list, and you spoke out for the truth. Can you tell us about that very bizarre episode?
Yes. Right. I mean, you knew right away, right? This is bogus. This is a bogus list. And interestingly, one of our board members, who just has, tremendous capacity to remember like names and different things he's read, when he saw that list, he recognized people who he'd maybe either seen it on Twitter or someplace else, that were members, DSA members, right? And, we started to dig a little bit, and then, we were part of that statewide owner coalition, and, a team there started to dig a little further too. And it turned out that quite a few of the names on that list were not property owners. They were not housing providers. They just signed the letter probably out of convenience, right? Including names of people that were running kind of nonprofit housing groups, right? Somebody signed, as president of such an entity, really without the authorization of his or her board to take that position. So, the whole thing was bogus. I mean, obviously, there was a follow-up, not in the Daily News, who originally printed it, but I believe the Post, did a follow-up piece on, some of the names that were on there, including the father of, the leading tenant activist in the state.
Wow. I mean, it's the stuff you see now that has unfortunately just become normal, it's frightening.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate, and I know we were speaking about the Regina bills, those were passed by the state Senate and the state Assembly right at the end, and a little extension of the last legislative session. As I last checked before we got on this podcast, they were not yet sent to the governor,
right,
by the state Senate for signature. Although, we'll have to see what'll happen. And of course, good cause eviction will continue to be part of the conversation that these tenant advocates will continue to push. So what is SPONY doing to, number one, continue to fight against these things, and number two, prepare its members in case these terrible proposed bills actually do become law?
Well, I mean, we just kind of like the little engine that could, right? We just keep plugging along. Like Friday, we have a meeting with some staff in the governor's office, and that's actually the first time we've ever been able to get an appointment, with someone on her staff. So, I feel maybe our efforts are being recognized if, we didn't get blown off by, by her office. Hopefully there's someone there that feels that there's value in listening to our voices. So we just, continue to reach out, work with our partners too, RSA, CHIP, REBNY, Apartments of New York, which is an upstate owner group, BRI, the Westchester owner group, and just try to have a, unified voice and so that lawmakers, understand the, the implications of some of this more crazy and legislation.
Yeah, and SPONY is in a way, SPONY is kind of at an at an advantage, at least, in terms of, the how things look, because, you're not these big corporate, so to speak, machines.
Right.
You are small property owners. And if you could get in the room with the governor and say, look, we're regular people who are just trying to make a living over here, at least it's the optics are, could be somewhat of an advantage, I would expect.
Right. I mean, because our voices are obviously authentic, right? It's not a lobbyist, coming in and speaking on behalf of us, or a public relations person. I mean, we are kind of unpolished, raw, real operators. And, when we share with someone, how something may really impact, our business, it is, I think it's a message that, a lot of lawmakers are open to listening to.
Yeah, and of course, all property owners are people. There are no corporate machines, of course. Everyone's made up of people, and just trying to make an honest living. I would just expect that the rhetoric that the tenant advocates are trying to push shouldn't necessarily be inconsistent with protecting small property owners, like SPONY, at least in their terms of thinking and their worldview.
Right. There's such a disconnect too. I think, it's just so easy to, beat up on the landlords, and, you often hear really kind of nasty comments, get a real job, and those sorts of things. But the reality is, property taxes fuel the economy in New York State, right? I mean, a huge percentage of New York City's operating budget is coming from the collection of property taxes, and that New York has this kind of insatiable appetite, right? The most recent number, I think, was over $24 billion. And that means it's a huge portion of my renters' monthly rent is just going right back to the city. It's a hidden tax.
And I'm sure SPONY, a lot of your lobbying efforts are, given that you represent small property owners, and property taxes are such a big expense and a major factor in those assets, that you're probably very busy with that. You've been speaking about getting the message out, and I've certainly seen your name around, and being vocal about a lot of things. What are some of the efforts that SPONY does to get that message out? Social media.
Yeah, we have a large group of SPONY members that are active on Twitter. There's a lot of other small owners that are on Twitter too that are not SPONY members necessarily. I mean, whenever I see a new voice out there, I'll often send a DM and say, "Hey, who are you?" And do you know SPONY? And sometimes they'll say, "Oh, I just prefer to, not identify myself, and I'm just going to, keep doing what I'm doing here on Twitter." But we do, we communicate weekly via a newsletter with all of our members, and share with them kind of opportunities for them to be better operators. Like yesterday, we shared a link to a program that the New York City Accelerator was running about solar incentives, reminders on things like, rent registrations and building registrations, and, the lead laws, and, all notices, and all sorts of things like that. So we, try to engage our members that way, just to, help educate them to be the best operators they can be, so that we can be good spokespeople too, right? I mean, we are, we definitely want to be the ones that are the providers that are following the rules, and, offering good, clean, quality housing.
And I know we spoke before about SPONY's involvement in the HSDPA lawsuit. I believe SPONY, correct me if I'm wrong, submitted an amicus brief in support of the petition for certiorari before the Supreme Court. And one of the SPONY members, I believe an individual member, was a named plaintiff in one of the cases. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about SPONY's involvement with the HSDPA lawsuit, and your thoughts about that?
Well, every SPONY member is, especially those that own rent stabilized housing, are watching this case closely. Those of us who never really knew the workings of the federal court system and the steps to get to the Supreme Court, have learned a lot in the last couple of years, including, listening in to those verbal, arguments. So it's really been fascinating to watch, and follow, updates. I know like your law firm will send updates, kind of along the way. So we're all watching it closely, and believe that if it's heard, could greatly impact what's happening in housing here in New York. In support of the case, we did submit an amicus brief, which was brief and not very filled with a lot of legal arguments, just more real life impact of the rent stabilization law on small housing providers, including examples about how these low rents are not covering operating expenses, and the impact that has on a building, the inability of someone to get possession back of a unit for their family use, and things like that. So it was, like I said, very personal experiences, as opposed to legal arguments.
Do you have any personal stories that you'd be able to share with us?
Yeah, sure. So my husband's family has owned the buildings, like I said, the first one since 1941, which, predated, rent control and rent stabilization. We have several tenants that have been with us, over 50 years, with rents that are just, don't even cover our operating expenses. So our tax bill this year, for each building is in excess of $90,000. So, you can do the math easily. 10 units, I need to be collecting, $9,200 in annual rent at least, just to cover the expenses. We have rents that don't do that. So the neighboring apartments, are kind of covering that operating shortfall. We have tenants that own homes outside of New York City. Fabulous places like, the Hamptons and Cape Cod and Florida. So, the idea that, rent stabilized housing is affordable housing, is a farce, right? That's not what's really happening. We have, I just spent a year's worth of rent in housing court trying to get permission to get into an apartment to make some repairs, right? The system's broken, right? That I would have to spend, $15,000 in legal fees to get access to fix property that we own and want to maintain properly. Is insane.
And that point that you just made seems to have been long forgotten and almost completely disregarded now by the current politicians. And it's a property that you own. Okay, the tenants are there renting it from you, but it is your property, and nobody can take that away from you. And that's they can't disregard that. It's your constitutional right to have certain property rights, and it's your property.
Right.
And what steps do you believe should be taken? There's a lot of talk about a housing crisis, and certainly from what I'm hearing from you today, it's an unsustainable housing market, housing situation from a small property owner's perspective. What steps do you believe that the politicians should take? On the one hand, considering that their constituency does involve a lot of tenants, because there are more tenants than landlords than there are in New York. So, being realistic, what kind of policies could they push to make a more sustainable housing market that'll make everybody happy?
Well, clearly, we need to have rental assistance, right? New York City is an expensive place to live, right? We just have limited housing, and we need more housing. That's obviously a big part of it. But rental assistance to people that can't afford their rent. With the rent stabilized housing providers, that burden is being put on the building owner, as opposed to it being, a shared taxpayer burden. So, that's one more example of the broken rent stabilization system. But, robust rental assistance with vouchers that are reliable, for the renter and for the housing provider. Right? You hear these stories all the time about, a voucher holder who's, but no fault of his or her own, it just, something falls through the cracks, and that voucher income stops inexplicably. putting a tremendous amount of stress, right, on the tenant, right, the renter who now, is in a very difficult situation, the owner who's continuing to provide the housing and not getting paid. And those sorts of problems are just kind of baked into New York City, right? I mean, that's been happening for decades. And I get calls and emails all the time. Like, I have an appointment next week with somebody who runs a nonprofit who really wants to kind of fix the system, and wants to talk to owners about how they could do that. So, whenever anybody reaches out, we always take that opportunity to speak to them and so that they can hear from our side what are the problems with these programs.
Right. And what are some of your goals this year? How are you working with stakeholders, other industry groups within the New York State real estate property owner community to accomplish some of those goals?
Right. I guess Good Cause Eviction is, for our members, always at the top of the list.
Yeah.
The idea of bringing universal rent control, to every unit of housing, in the state is, something our members don't want. Not all of our members are providing housing in New York City. We have plenty of members that are, in Westchester and Long Island and other parts of the state. So they are really not interested in having universal rent control, in Nassau County, Suffolk County, and some of those, other places around the state. So that's on the top of our list. But and more locally, it would be, trying to, speak some sense to, Mayor Adams and his administration about the scaffolding law, right, and expanding lead laws and any other kind of regulation they come up with. Intro 632, which was the potential ban on criminal background checks. That is a problem. And it's not just the housing providers that are worried about that. I mean, you see the crime and safety groups too, around the state that are not thrilled about potentially, having a neighbor that might put them in danger. So,
And it's another example of how the tenant-leaning, legislators' policies, which are really punitive in nature towards landlords, ultimately end up affecting tenants just as much.
Right.
This is one example with the scaffolding law, with the criminal background checks, but rent regulation itself, you see since the HSTPA, I can't repeat this enough. When you take away the ability for an owner to get his or her investment back from making renovations to an apartment, owners will stop investing in the apartment, and it'll just cause the real estate to just decay. It's a business. Okay. It's a property that you own and you will invest in if you will get your investment back. If you won't get your investment back, this is not a charity. It's a business at the end of the day.
Right.
And looking ahead, what are your hopes for the future of housing in New York? I guess in the short term and in the long term.
Right. I guess in the long term, it would be a decision from SCOTUS, right? That would, right.
Short term, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, we'll know, right? September, October, if they're going to take the case, right? But, a market that allows all different providers to operate successfully, right? Which would allow, tenants to, have ample options of, places to live, right? That, some people, seek out small buildings with small owners. They want to know who their owner is. Other people, prefer, the big high-rise building with all the bells and whistles and, a staff in the lobby that, they can go in and yell and scream at, right? If they're not happy. So, people want different types of housing. I guess our goal would be that, that there is a space for small operators, multi-generational family-run businesses like SPONY members to continue to do what we've been doing for decades. A market where future immigrant groups can do what my husband's grandparents did, right? Work hard, save, and, achieve the American dream, through property ownership. I see that very, that's becoming less and less viable in today's market.
Ann, thank you so much for joining us. How can listeners get in touch with you?
You can find SPONY at spony.org. If you are a small property owner and you want to learn a little bit more, want to speak to one of us, you can email us at info@spony.org, spony.org. You can follow us on Twitter, The Real SPONY. I would say, there's a tremendous kind of resource for small owners. It's a great kind of brotherhood. We, lean on each other, share resources. Hey, I need a good roofer, I need a good accountant, I need a good lawyer. We share that kind of information with each other, and we try to provide resources on our website. Have webinars and in-person meetings, kind of bring best practices, to our members. Like I said, we want our members to be the best providers they can be, so that we are, a good example to other owners.
Okay, well, Ann, thank you very much, and we thank you for your continued advocacy and hard work in fighting these terrible policies and pushing for good policies to protect property rights in New York, and as they've been at risk, in recent years. So thank you again, Ann, for joining. It was an incredibly informative episode. And
thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.